All right, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, and I know we have a whack of new people joining us for the first time today, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms for free around the world. And if you're joining us today, you probably know that this is the kickoff of our epic week of climate change events. We are doing 23 programs in 5 days. Already today, we talked about marine plastics in the North and the Arctic with Jennifer Provencher. We went live to Svalbard to hear from the ladies at Hearts in the Ice. And now we are diving in on disappearing Pacific Islands with Krista Langlois. She has written for all sorts of amazing publications around the world and has personal experience in some of the island groups that are actually being as negatively affected by climate change as it is possible to be on this planet, where you are literally losing the land that you stand on. It's a topic that I don't think we've ever covered here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. So I'm very excited about it. I hope you guys are too. And whether you're joining us live or on YouTube, buckle up and we are going to have a lot of fun together. Krista, thank you so much for joining us today, and I cannot wait to hear your awesome story. Take us away.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I am excited to be here. I'm actually joining you from Colorado, Southwest Colorado, kind of the edge between the desert and the mountains, which is where I've lived for the last 8 years, and which is kind of a strange place to have ended up after spending the last most of the rest of my life living close to the ocean. I'm super landlocked here. And before this, I lived on a lot of islands and coasts, and I still write about the ocean, marine science, people who live on the ocean, which is kind of a good way for me to stay connected to the ocean, which I love, while being here in Colorado. So as Jesse mentioned, Jesse, do you want me to start the slideshow now?
Yeah, you can bring it up whenever you'd like, and then I have it in the background. We can play that while you're talking about all the amazing places. That's a great visual for us.
Right. So I'm going to start a slideshow while I talk. And these are all pictures from the Marshall Islands, from various different trips that I took there, starting in 2006, when I only had a really old point-and-shoot digital camera. So you'll see the picture quality start to slowly increase and get better. They're mostly from the Marshall Islands themselves, and a few at the very end are going to be from Marshallese communities living in the United States. So I'm going to start that slideshow so you guys have something a little more exciting than my face to look at. Let's see, here we go. I don't know how to make the music stop though. Music. Can you guys hear that music?
Yeah, we can. It wasn't playing in the test earlier, but oh, it stopped now. There you go.
Okay, good. Excellent. Is the slideshow playing?
We have all your pictures. No, it ended it somehow or other.
All right,
we'll start it out together. This is half the fun of video.
All right.
And the music. Okay, and then go back to, so right at the bottom where it says play slideshow, right in that, and you're in, that should work like it did in test. Beautiful. You're perfect.
Here we go. Play.
Yeah. And
all right.
Excellent.
Fabulous. Okay. So yeah, a little bit more about me. As Jesse mentioned, I am a freelance journalist and writer, which means that I don't work for any particular publication except myself. And I submit stories or story ideas to various magazines like National Geographic, Smithsonian, Outside Magazine, and if the editors like my idea, they assign me the story. And sometimes that means I get to travel to really cool places like the Arctic or Pacific Islands. And sometimes it means, particularly in the last year or so, that I do my best reporting it from my desk here in Colorado. But it's a really cool way to get to meet interesting people and talk to interesting people and share their stories and their research with the rest of the world. It's kind of my dream job, honestly, so I feel really fortunate to be doing it. I graduated from college in 2006, and a couple of weeks after I graduated, I got on an airplane and I flew to the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which up until maybe a month or two before I went, I had never heard of and had no idea where it was in the world. So in case you also have not heard of it, it is a teeny tiny little group of islands in the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by an absolutely massive amount of water. And if you kind of drew a triangle between Japan, Australia, and Hawaii, the Marshall Islands are smack dab in the middle. They're part of a larger island group called Micronesia, which means small islands. And they are really small islands, as you might have seen in some of the early pictures in my slideshow. They're like these, they look, when you're flying in, it's kind of crazy because you've been flying, so for me, I would leave California and then fly to Hawaii, which is like 5 hours of nothing but ocean. And then you land on the island group of Hawaii, change planes, and then you fly for another 5 hours over, and you see nothing but ocean the entire time. And then all of a sudden you start to see these, like, they look like snakes of land. They're super skinny little islands. And they usually are in rings, like a ring of these skinny islands. And the way that they formed was a long time ago. There was a volcano. The volcano, the middle of it collapsed, and it left kind of a ring of land that became these very low-lying atolls, they're called. I think the highest point in the entire country of the Marshall Islands is 14 feet above sea level. So these are just, I mean, most of the islands are dead flat and kind of flush with the ocean. And there's an absolutely, like I mentioned, a lot of water compared to the amount of land. The comparison is if you took the entirety of the United States, but instead of land, it was water. And then you took the city of Baltimore and you chopped it up into teeny tiny pieces and kind of scattered those little pieces of land of Baltimore across all of the United States. Those little pieces of Baltimore would be the Marshall Islands, and the rest of the United States would be the Pacific Ocean. So it is a country that is made up more of water than of land. And the people who live there are, their lives, as you can imagine, are just so deeply connected to the ocean. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute, but let me back up and explain how I got there. So I had never left New England, where I'm from, and really wanted to explore and see other parts of the world. And I didn't have a lot of money to do so. And so I was looking at things like Peace Corps and different ways to travel and live in other countries. And honestly, I just couldn't really afford most of them. And then I found this program that was called World Teach, and they went to the Marshall Islands. And the Marshall Islands was the only place where you did not have to pay a dime up front to go there. They paid for your plane ticket and sent you off to one of these remote atolls to teach English for a year. And you lived with a host family and got a small stipend every month. And so I looked at some pictures of the Marshall Islands, said, cool, tropical islands, turquoise water, palm trees, free, looks great, sign me up. So that's how I landed there. And I was living on an atoll called Ebon, which you're looking at right now. The picture you're looking at right now is the inside of the airport on Ebon. And that is the landing strip where the plane lands, that grassy area. So I landed there with no knowledge, no background, didn't speak the language. I was the only outsider on this island of about 500 people. And I stayed for a year and I taught English. And I was like, why on earth? Like, it seemed kind of like a silly thing to be teaching English. I didn't really, I didn't understand why it would be valuable to my students. And nobody at the time was talking about climate change, at least people in the Marshall Islands. I mean, there were certainly scientists, Western scientists, who were beginning to bring it to wider attention, but it wasn't something that was being talked about among everyday people, at least in the Marshall Islands. So I wasn't thinking about it. And I left, and after a year, and then went on and did a few other things in my life. And starting around like maybe 2012 or so, I started getting all these Facebook friend requests from my former students in the Marshall Islands. And I mean, keep in mind that when I lived there, there was no internet, there was no cell phone service, there was no electricity. If I wanted to, when I was on this island, if I wanted to communicate with my mom back home, I had to handwrite her a letter, wait for the plane to come. The plane was supposed to come once a week, but often only came once a month. And that letter would go on the plane, and it would take weeks at least for that letter to reach my mom, and then she would handwrite a letter back to me. And that was our only communication with the outside world. And so I started getting all these Facebook friend requests and started realizing that so many of my former students from the Marshall Islands were living in the US. And I was like, wow, I guess me teaching them English was actually a pretty valuable skill after all. And then I started realizing, I started looking more into people leaving the Marshall Islands and coming to America, and it was happening so much more frequently than I had ever thought about or had realized. So that was when I pitched a story to a publication, a Canadian publication called Hakai. And I just wanted to know, with so many people leaving the Marshall Islands, I think it's like a third of the overall population, there's 80,000 people altogether that consider themselves Marshallese, and a third of those now live in the United States. And with so many people leaving their homes and their islands, and when so much of their culture is tied to the islands and to the ocean, and a lot of them were settling in landlocked places like Arkansas and Oklahoma, like, how is that culture going to survive? How is it going to change and adapt? These are the questions that I had, and I didn't have answers. So Hakai sent me back to the Marshall Islands to start to look at the impact of climate change on Marshallese culture and people. And then they sent me to Oklahoma as well to talk with the Marshallese community who is living in Oklahoma, which is a pretty sizable community, like thousands of people. So that's my story of reporting on the Marshall Islands and living there. And so now I'll talk a little bit more about what that culture is like and what I learned and what I found. Marshallese people got to the Marshall Islands roughly 2,000 years ago, and I have a 2-year-old, so I've been watching the movie Moana a lot. And if any of you guys have seen the movie Moana, which, like, I love that movie so much, it's really good. The whole kind of point of Moana is that their ancestors were voyagers, the Hawaiian people in Moana. Their ancestors were wayfinders. They could sail across these absolutely vast distances on these relatively small outrigger canoes and navigate using not only the stars and the sky, but in the case of the Marshallese people, they would do something called wave piloting, and they would study as boys or as kids. They would float on their backs in the ocean for hours and feel the way the waves felt as they bounced off a shore and came back, and feel the way that different currents in the ocean felt. These really, really, really minute sensations that Western scientists are now trying to understand, and are like so minute that they can't be picked up by scientific instruments. But the Marshallese people knew them and could feel them. So in addition to using the stars in the sky and all these other environmental cues to navigate, they would use just the feel of the ocean itself. And so they would be at sea for weeks on end without seeing land, eating preserved fermented foods. And then they would find these teeny tiny specks of land in the vast ocean, and essentially set up their lives and communities and societies there. And so they were master wayfinders, master navigators, excellent fishermen. I forget how many different words there are in the Marshallese language for fishing, but it's, there's this old saying about like Inuit people have however many different words for snow. Well, like the Marshallese people have like, and it's dozens. Marshallese people have that many words for fishing. And they're just really good at living as much on the water as on land. They don't have words for left and right, because when you're standing on these narrow little strips of land, the lagoon, which is kind of like the protected ring of ocean in between the islands, where there's not big waves and it's really turquoise and beautiful, that's always on one side of you, and the crashing waves of the open ocean are on the other side of you. So instead of left and right, they have lagoon side and ocean side, and those they can flip. So their language, their food, they're just everything about their culture is their songs. Everything is tied to the ocean. And as this ocean is rising, which it is rising, and by most scientific estimates, it is going to rise perhaps by the year 2050. It's going to rise to levels that are going to pretty much flood the Marshall Islands and other low-lying coral atolls. And that's already starting to happen. I think it was maybe in 2008 or 9, the first big, they call them inundation events, but it's just a huge flood. And it usually happens when the highest tide of the year corresponds to like a storm surge or a storm surge. And so these huge waves come, enormous waves, and they just absolutely swamp these islands, fill people's homes. So when the first one happened in like 2008 or 2009, people were like, well, that's part of life on this type of island where we've chosen to live, and it happens once every 100 years. And people talked about it like, yeah, this was one of these big events that happens once every 100 years. But then it happened again the next year. Then it happened 2 times the year after that. And so they're happening already more and more often. And the people who I talked to there who are studying climate change said it's not going to be like one day people wake up and whoop, our islands are gone. The ocean is just going to encroach further and further until each individual family or person kind of reaches their threshold where they realize, the value of living in my homeland on places where my ancestors are buried, with my people and my community. Like, the value of all of that is no longer worth the risk of having the ocean coming into my home this often and having all of my possessions lost, having the bones of if the ocean floods the cemeteries and people's graves get washed away. And that's really difficult to think about your ancestors, just their bone. You can wake up with your great grandmother's hip bone or femur, sitting in your front yard. And so people kind of reach their own personal threshold and say, I've had enough, I'm going to leave. And the thing with the Marshall Islands, the reason why there are so many people from the Marshall Islands in the United States is because in the 1940s and 50s, the United States government tested out atomic bombs, nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands. Like, an absolutely mind-blowing number of bombs were dropped in the Marshall Islands. I wish I had the figures in front of me, but I don't. But if you've heard of the nuclear bombings in Japan during World War II, Hiroshima, it was the equivalent of 52 Hiroshima bombs being dropped in the Marshall Islands. And the government chose 2 islands called Bikini, where where your bathing suit bikini, that's where that word comes from, and then Wetanak, and I pronounced that wrong, sorry. Anyway, they chose 2 atolls that were where people lived, that were beautiful, rich atolls. And there are plenty of uninhabited atolls in the United States or in the Marshall Islands that the government could have chosen to bomb. But they chose ones where people live. And they asked the people to leave. You just have to leave for a couple weeks and then you can all come back. And the people left and they still haven't been able to go back because their homelands are filled with nuclear radiation. You can't eat the fish there. And the people who were evacuated from those islands were sent to live on other uninhabited islands. And the ones that were uninhabited for a reason, because they're not very good to live on. They don't have good lagoons, or they don't have good protected lagoons for fishing, or they don't have any water, or whatever, various reasons. So people were evacuated from their homelands, sent to live on these other less ideal islands, and have still never been able to go back. And there's so many repercussions of that. They couldn't fish anymore. So they started eating, the US government provided them with, canned meat like Spam and processed foods. And then rates of diabetes went up. And cancers and birth defects also went up because of the nuclear radiation. So the Marshall Islands are now an independent nation. And when they gained independence in 1989, one of the sort of stipulations was that any Marshallese person, because of this terrible history that the US government imposed on the people of the Marshall Islands, today, any person from the Marshall Islands can come to the US and live and work indefinitely. You don't need any special visa. You don't need any special, you don't have to, apply for residency or citizenship or anything like that. So that's why so many Marshallese people, as their homes are flooding, are coming to the United States. And some of the first people who came to the US, a missionary who had been working at a church in the Marshall Islands was from Arkansas and said, oh, come with me, come back to Arkansas. And there are these chicken processing plants there in Arkansas. And they were always looking for kind of cheap labor, like Marshallese people were absolutely willing to work for. And so they got jobs at these chicken processing plants. And then they wrote to their family members and said, hey, come out and join me. And family joined family. And there ended up being a huge Marshallese population in Arkansas, another in Oklahoma, and then there are smaller populations in Oregon and Hawaii as well. But the biggest one is in Arkansas. And so I was really wondering, with all of these people living far away from the ocean, what was going to happen to their culture. And so in addition to the actual land itself, the islands themselves being lost, so much of Marshallese culture is kind of, I worried that it was disappearing in the absence of the ocean. So I went to Oklahoma because this girl you're looking at right now, the one in the sort of fuchsia, she lived in Oklahoma, and she was one of the sisters in the family that I had lived with when I was in the Marshall Islands. So I went to Oklahoma because that's where she lived. And I talked with a lot of people there, and, there's no easy answers. Marshallese, the former minister of something or other who has recently died from the Marshall Islands, he likened climate change to cultural genocide. And genocide, as you might know, is when you try to wipe out an entire group of people. And so he likened climate change to, wiping out the Marshallese culture. And I found that was not entirely true. And actually, in many cases, I found that in response to climate change, a lot of aspects of Marshallese culture that were in danger of being lost, such as sailing these traditional outrigger canoes and using these traditional wayfinding navigational techniques, rather than being lost, people are reviving them. People are really holding on to the qualities that make them Marshallese, that give them their identity. And like, for sure, there are aspects of that that are going to be lost when you lose your land and when you lose your islands. When I was in Oklahoma, there were some kids whose parents had been evacuated from Bikini Atoll when the bombs were being dropped. And so these kids, their parents had come to the US. They were among the first Marshallese people to come to the US. And their kids had been born here and had never been to the Marshall Islands. And they had never seen the ocean. And I got to their classrooms after just coming back from the Marshall Islands myself. And they were like, they were like, tell me about the ocean. Like, what is it like? Did you swim in the ocean? And I said, yeah. And it was really poignant and a little bit sad. And sometimes I would be like in the grocery store in Oklahoma, and I would see a person who I could just clearly tell was Marshallese, and I would say something to them in the Marshallese language, like, "Yakweo, come on more," and they would just like look at me blankly because they didn't speak Marshallese. And one time I went to a church celebration, and they didn't have any fish, and so the minister's daughters and I like ran to this got in my rental car and drove to this all-you-can-eat buffet and just like piled to-go containers with whatever fried fish was at this all-you-can-eat buffet in Oklahoma, and we brought it back so there could be some kind of fish. So, to be sure, there is a lot that's being lost, but at the same time, Marshallese people are so resilient, and they are again, reviving these traditional wayfinding techniques. And there's this Harvard particle physicist who is super interested in traditional wayfinding, and he's trying to sort of capture this traditional knowledge into like scientific language and trying to record it so that it'll be available for future generations. There's another guy who in the Marshall Islands who's Marshallese, who is creating what he calls a digital Noah's Ark, and is recording all of the Marshallese names for the different fish and fishing techniques and plants and animals that are kind of only found in and around the Marshall Islands. And he's making this digital Noah's Ark so people can reference that. Traditional tattooing techniques that were, and tattoo styles that were almost lost under colonialism are being revived, and a lot of people now have traditional tattoos, and those tattoos are echoes of the ocean. They mimic fish scales or waves or different designs that are inspired by the ocean. So in a lot of ways, a lot of things are being lost, and a lot of things are also being preserved. And there's also so much hope that people will be able to stay on their islands. And Marshall Islands, for being such a tiny nation, are like really leading the way in terms of protecting the oceans from overfishing and they're advocating on national and international forums for keeping carbon emissions down and keeping the climate from spiraling out of control. And there is a lot of hope that, that despite the scientific predictions, that they are not going to lose their islands, that they are not going to leave, because as one Marshallese poet says, without our islands, we are nothing. I think I have no idea how long I've been talking, because all I can see are these, I don't have a clock, all I can see are these pictures just going over and over and over. So
they're perfect. It was a perfect length presentation. We're at the exact half-hour mark, Krista. So if you want to come out of screen share, you can see us again, have a bit of a conversation. We'll dive in with Q&A. But I want to just thank you to begin with for such a really touching personal story of your own experiences there, and how people are really being impacted by this in a way that I think, presentations on marine plastics, presentations on some of the other things we're doing this week, while really important and really impactful, don't highlight the human toll of climate change that is happening currently and will be happening in the Marshall Islands. So I really appreciate all this chat today. And I want to dive in with queries. We've got 6 live classes. We've got at least 5 more on YouTube. So over 250 kids are watching this broadcast from across the continent. So welcome into all of you. If you're on YouTube, share questions in the chat bar. We'll take as many as we can. But what we're going to do is start with Mr. Shattuck's class. They're joining us in Chalk River, Ontario. If you guys want to come and have a question to kick us off, we'll do a one round with everybody. So Mr. Shattuck, come on in, guys.
Hello. How many Marshall Islands are there?
There are thousands of actual islands, but some of them are really small and nobody lives on them. They're like the size of the room that I'm standing in. So there's thousands of actual islands, but I believe, oh my gosh, it's been so long. Do you mind if I feel like I need to look this up really quick?
Google is half our fun on these broadcasts. I love these superlative questions like how many, how big, and it's really tricky to know that. But no, that's great. Like, I mean, just generally the vibe that there's many islands. There's some ranging from huge places where tons of people can live to lots of thousands of little ones that are, again, the size of the room is perfect. And if you do happen to find a specific answer later in the broadcast,
I'm going to say it's like 52 that are inhabited atolls, but I can definitely look that up.
I'll check it too while you're answering more questions in a minute as well, Krista. So we're all set either way, but that's perfect. Thanks so much, Mr. Shattuck's class. All right, Miss Corkery's class, you guys are joining in lovely Peterborough. It's been a while since I've been there. Lovely spot. If you have any questions for us, come on in and go for it, guys.
Can you explain the links in between climate change and rising sea levels?
Yeah, that's that's a really good question. I should have really prepared more for this. It has been years since I have reported on the specific issue. So the humans are putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere from things like burning fossil fuels. And those greenhouse gases, carbon and methane, warm things up. And as things warm up, the glaciers, particularly in the Arctic and the Antarctic, are melting. And as those huge amounts of ice melt, that causes the ocean levels to rise. I think that's the most simple way to describe it.
That's a perfect way to describe it. One of the other elements that we don't often talk about here is that when water gets hotter, it expands. You can see this with a cup of water. If you heat it up, it'll actually take up a little bit more volume, which is another contributor to sea levels rising, which again, if you're on a coast where there's a 100-foot cliff between you and the coast, a little sea level rise doesn't make much difference. If you're on a very, very flat island in the middle of the Pacific, it's much more impactful. But that is the basic principle and something that, you're right, we haven't actually highlighted that in the lead up to the Climate Change Festival either. So the bare basics are good. So thank you so much, Ms. Courtney.
Real quick, I got the answer to the first question too. Perfect. 1,200 total islands arranged into 29 atolls.
Nice. That was some rapid fire Googling. I like it. You're a whole pro. Let's head to Hillfield, Strathallan class. So Mr. Mitchell's class, come on in, guys. Just mute that mic and you're good to go. Oh, there you go.
We've been learning about Indigenous games at Hillfield. What traditional activities did the Marshall Islands do?
Traditional games? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, like the Indigenous communities there. It's something that a lot of kids in Ontario are learning about a lot nowadays. And so I'm curious what the sort of situation is in the Marshall Islands that you experienced personally.
I did not experience a lot of traditional games. When I was there were volleyball nets set up and people were just really, really into playing volleyball and basketball. So, gosh, I can't think of any games that I saw that would have sort of predated European contact. But there was tons of music and singing and dancing. Marshallese people, and I don't know what the precursors to ukuleles would have been, but whenever ukuleles got there, like the minute somebody can pick up a ukulele at the age of like 1.5 or 2, they start playing, and everybody can play ukuleles, and everybody sings and dances. And so there is a ton of that going on. And the kids in general, as somebody who now has a 2-year-old, and my 2-year-old's life is like pretty heavily supervised, the kids in the Marshall Islands have pretty wonderful childhoods. It is like a Pacific Islander trait or characteristic, I guess, that the older kids usually take care of the younger kids. So once a kid is like 2 years old, they're just off with the other kids of the island all day long, and like really with no adult supervision, they kind of just run wild, and they've got amazing jungle and beaches and reefs to play on and swim in, and it's a pretty great place to be a kid, honestly. I hope to get back there sometime with my kid and let her experience that.
We certainly hope you do too, and we can do a broadcast after the fact to find out what that cross-cultural, pollination was like. Very, very cool, Krista. I love that question, guys, too, and thank you guys so much for highlighting Indigenous communities and places. That was a really important question. Before we go to Ms. Berger in just a second, I want to take a question from Mr. Patrick's grade 8 geography class. They're joining us in London, Ontario, and he wanted to know, or Alex in his class wanted to know, how do the Marshallese get fresh drinking water? Is there streams or rivers or anything like that there?
That's a great question. There are no streams or rivers. They collect rainwater and into these huge catchments, and that is drinking water for the most part. They also have wells, and the wells tend to be not great for drinking because they're a little bit salty, they're a little bit brackish, but when people get really desperate, if there's a drought and there's not enough rainwater to drink, then they can use those wells and drink that water if they have to, but people sometimes kind of get sick from drinking that well water. And one thing that I didn't mention is that many people in the Marshall Islands are as concerned about droughts as they are about rising sea levels, because droughts are also increasing in frequency and in intensity with climate change. So like Australia, for instance, has a huge desalinator, which takes ocean water and removes the salt and turns it into drinkable water. They have this huge ship that pretty much just goes around between the Marshall Islands now, because a lot of communities are experiencing frequent droughts and are running short of drinking water and are relying on that. So that's a really great question that also kind of plays into the how climate change is impacting the Marshall Islands.
Yeah. I'm really, really happy you brought that up, because I think with a lot of classes, certainly when I was younger, when I thought about climate change, it was hot and cold. That was the biggest thing to me. But hot and cold changes around the world do affect precipitation. I mean, we see this in Toronto, where I am. There's a lot more flooding nowadays. There's a lot more big storm events when they shouldn't really be happening. The US, Australia, we've seen droughts, more fires in the west coast of North America. So this is really a topic that we're going to keep coming back to throughout the week of climate change events, is drought versus big flooding events. And so I think that's a great question, guys, and thank you for highlighting that, Krista. All right, we're going to go to Ms. Berger's class, Mr. Chitaro and Ms. Triffo, take a couple from YouTube, and that'll be about time. It's where time flies and you're having fun talking about these topics, guys. So Ms. Berger's class, they are joining us in Mississauga, right down the street from me. Come on in, guys. Take us away.
Hi, Krista. My grade 5s are wondering, how do scientists measure the rising sea levels, and are different islands affected based on their location in the Pacific?
That is a great question. And there are a lot of ways that scientists measure rising sea levels. And one of the most basic is, literally just a yardstick or, some sort of measuring device that is just on the coastline. I think that's one of the most rudimentary ways. But now there are all of these robot buoys, for lack of a better phrase, these very high-tech buoys that get kind of tossed out at sea in various places. I mean, they don't just get tossed, they get placed in various locations, and they collect data on a lot of different factors like temperature, salinity, waves, and also the rise, and they send that data automatically back to scientists. So that's providing a little bit more of a nuanced picture. And in terms of the second part of the question, I don't think within the Marshall Islands itself that there's huge differences from one island to the other in terms of the actual amount of sea level rise. Certainly some islands are more prone to flooding and to the these huge waves and king tides, just based on their topography, based on whether they have a lagoon to help protect them, based on, what angle the wind hits them at. So some are more prone to flooding than others, but within the Marshall Islands, the amount of sea level rise is basically the same. But it's my understanding that across the world, sea level rise is not affecting every place equally. And I don't entirely understand the science behind that, but the seas are rising slightly more in certain regions than in others.
Very cool question, Ms. Berger. I love that. Thank you so much. All right, guys, we're going to head down the 401 about 3.5 hours to Windsor to Mr. Chicharo's class. Just unmute that microphone and you are good to go.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, Krista. The reference you make to the people that have left the Marshall Islands or those that will leave, do they use the term climate change refugee or environmental refugee? Is that something they would consider themselves?
I haven't run across anybody who has referred to themselves personally that way. It's definitely a term that's used within the Marshall Islands. Like, there are Marshallese people who will say that, we might become climate change refugees or something like that. But I have not heard any particular person refer to themselves that way. And that said, it's been almost 6 years since I reported my big story and since I've been in the Marshall Islands. And at that time, a lot of the people who I knew who were coming to the US were coming for better opportunities for education, for that sort of thing. There were very few who were leaving at that time specifically because of climate change. And I know that has definitely started to shift a little bit over the last 6 years. So while I personally haven't met anybody who called themselves a climate refugee, they very well could be out there.
Very cool question. I'm glad we can get sort of this broad scale terminology that you hear about in the news nowadays and sort of combine that with what people are actually feeling about their situation. I think that your story about Marshallese people getting to come to the US and that sort of, the backdrop of that, highlighting the atomic bomb testing, is a really, really important element to this. And I'll make sure that people get a link to where they can find out more about that at the end of the broadcast. Krista, we're going to wrap up with one more question. We're going to Brampton to Miss Triffo's class. If you want to just unmute your microphone, come on in and wrap us up.
Hello, we actually have 2 questions. So the first one was, do you think there's anything that we can do to fix the climate change now? And then the other one was more about your career. What inspired you to get into contract journalism as a career? And did you go to college for that, or did you change careers later?
So in regards to the first question about whether there's anything you can do, I think there really needs to be a mix of individual choices, and individual actions and broader scale policies and big changes by government. So I think there's a way to contribute to both. Certainly in your own personal life, just, being aware of the choices you make, like, what kind of, as there's becoming more and more electric vehicles and solar power and ways to use less greenhouse gases. I know that those kinds of choices are not always available to kids. Like, that's more like the choices that your parents are making. And that they're also it can be expensive to buy like an electric vehicle or to put a solar panel on your house or something like that. But, those kinds of things do make a difference. And I think learning about climate change is honestly the biggest thing that kids can do, because the more you know about it, the more you understand about it, the better equipped you're going to be to take action when you are older. And I mean, there's already a lot of instances of kids leading lawsuits to try to mitigate the effect of climate change. And as you get older and are able to make those choices and advocate to your governments, local government, national government, whatever, to try to enact policies that will reduce global warming, reduce the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, carbon emissions. I think all of that stuff together is going to make a difference. So I hope that kind of answers the first question.
That's a perfect answer. That's great. Yeah.
And then as to the second question about what inspired me to get into journalism, I did not major in journalism in college. I majored in English. I took a couple of journalism classes. And then, for the first 10 years or so after I graduated from college, I really bounced around between various jobs a lot. I worked for a while as a newspaper reporter, but I got kind of bored and I missed adventure. So then I went to Alaska and I worked as a canoeing guide in the Inside Passage, and kind of went back and forth a lot between sort of more writing oriented jobs and more adventure oriented jobs, and wanted a way to combine the two of them, and which is how I eventually settled on contract or freelance journalism that focuses on the outdoors, on science, on people and nature, and the way that those people and nature interact, which is kind of where the kinds of stories that I am naturally attracted to, and which as a career sort of satisfy both that need for adventure and the more creative intellectual aspect of writing that I also really love.
What a beautiful answer. I always love when we get the question of how people end up in certain careers. And it's so interesting because I think when you're a kid, a lot of people have this idea that you start on one track and you end up in some future destination. You plan that the whole way. And so many of the speakers we bring on this broadcast bounce around. They follow different passions. They end up doing things that they never would have expected. I mean, I love your story about going to the Marshall Islands because there was this program. It was free. It was someplace you'd never heard of a few weeks before. And it's really helped shape your life and career. And I think that's a really special message for kids to hear. I also love the answer to the question about climate change, what you can do. I mean, our central message this week as an organization is don't waste. This is something that all our speakers seem to harp on, whether that's emissions, plastics, food. If you don't waste, if you try and get that mindset, you'll really help succeed in accomplishing a lot of conservation goals around the world. So thank you so much, Krista, for all of this. I wanted to bring up a few quick notes before we wrap up our broadcast in a second. If you're keen to see some of Krista's amazing writing, check out her website here. She is on social media as well. So some really, really nice pieces there. She mentioned specifically Hakai Magazine. I want to highlight them. They're Canadian. They're fantastic. They do a lot of great work. If you want to find out more about wayfinding and the amazing Pacific Islanders and how they traversed the entire ocean, The Wayfinders by Wade Davis is an incredible book, especially for high schoolers. And if you want to learn more about the atomic bomb testing that happened in the Marshall Islands, the Bikini and Enomotak atolls, is where you can learn more. Lots of information on Google, so do check that out when you're done the broadcast. Krista, this was great. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so what we're going to do at the end of every broadcast, since this is your first time with us, I'm going to bring in every one of our classrooms. So Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Chitaro, Miss Berger, Miss Triffo, Mr. Shattuck, and Miss Corkery, if you can join me in saying goodbye.
Thanks, Krista. Appreciate it.